The color left his face so completely, so fast, that for a moment I thought he might actually pass out right there in that conference room chair. His hand found the edge of the table, not to gesture, not to make a point, just to hold himself up. He pressed his palm flat against the wood and stared at the phone sitting in the center of that table like it had just grown teeth. My name is Nora Scott, and I had just pressed play. There were four people in that room: me, my ex husband Daniel Ferreira, his attorney, and a woman who had spent the better part of 8 months telling my 8-year-old son that his mother was gone for good. Daniel's sister, Claudia Ferreira Moss, she was the one who went still first, not pale still. The kind of still that comes right before something breaks. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even shift in my seat, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Hartford, Connecticut. It was a Tuesday in late March, the kind of day where the sky can't commit to anything, not sun, not rain, just a flat gray that sits on the city like a lid. I had driven myself. I had worn the blazer I bought the previous spring, the charcoal one that Daniel used to say made me look like I was trying too hard. I wore it on purpose. I had arrived 11 minutes early and waited in the lobby without touching my phone, just sitting with my hands folded and my heartbeat steady, because I had been preparing for this moment for longer than anyone in that room understood. To understand what happened in that conference room, you have to understand what the 8 years before it looked like. You have to understand what kind of woman Claudia Ferrer Moss is, what kind of family I married into, and exactly how long I had been watching, waiting, and quietly building the thing that would eventually protect my son. I met Daniel Ferreira when I was 26 years old at a conference in Boston. He was charming in the way that certain people are charming when they have spent their entire lives being told they are exceptional. His family had money, not new money, not flashy money, but the kind of old, settled, generational money that comes with opinions about everything. What neighborhoods were acceptable? What schools mattered? What kind of woman belonged at a Ferrera family dinner table? I did not initially belong. I grew up in Meriden, Connecticut, the daughter of a postal worker and a woman who spent 20 years doing bookkeeping for a small manufacturing company. My parents were not poor, but they were not the Ferreras. And the Ferreras, particularly Claudia, never let me forget that distinction, though they were always far too polished to say it plainly. It came through in other ways. The way Claudia would ask how things were going at my job with that particular tilt of her head, like she expected the answer to confirm something she already believed. The way Daniel's mother, Viviane Ferreira, would suggest helpful articles about work-life balance whenever I mentioned anything about my career. The way family gatherings always seemed to include at least one comment from someone about how lucky I was to have married into such a stable situation. I was a financial analyst when Daniel and I got married. I had my certifications, I had built a clean reputation in a mid-size firm, and I had a specific, private plan for what I wanted to do with the decade ahead of me. I kept that plan quiet around the Ferreras because I had learned early that sharing ambition with people who have decided what you are allowed to be tends to produce exactly two outcomes: dismissal or sabotage. I preferred neither. Daniel and I had our son Mateo when I was 29. He was the most important thing that had ever happened to me. And for a while, maybe 3 years, maybe four, I believed that the marriage was going to work in spite of everything. I believed Daniel was different from his family, even when the evidence started suggesting otherwise. That belief cost me time I could have spent differently. The first time I understood exactly what I was dealing with, Mateo was about 2 years old. We were at a Ferreira family dinner at Viviane's house, a large colonial in Glastonbury that had been in the family for 30 years. Claudia had brought her husband, Roland Moss, and their two daughters. The dinner was going the way those dinners always went. Roland talking about his commercial real estate investments, Claudia redirecting every conversation back to her children's achievements, Vivian looking at me across the table with that particular expression she had that I can only describe as tolerant neutrality. I had spent that week finalizing a deal that had taken me 3 months of quiet, relentless work. A referral I had cultivated through my own network, a client I had brought in without any institutional support. I hadn't mentioned it to Daniel yet because the contract hadn't been signed, and I didn't discuss unsigned contracts. The deal closed on Thursday. The family dinner was Sunday. At some point during the meal, Claudia set her fork down and turned to me with genuine seeming concern on her face. Nora, have you thought about maybe looking at something with more stability? Something where you're not so dependent on the market? I have a friend at an insurance company who is always looking for people with your background. She said it the way someone says it when they believe they are being kind, helpful, when what they actually mean is, you're not built for what you think you're built for. I smiled. I told her I appreciated it. That night, after Mateo was asleep, I opened my laptop and transferred the first substantial deposit into the college fund I had set up for him 4 months earlier at a separate financial institution, the one the Ferreras knew nothing about. A 529 account, funded that week with a contribution from the commission I had just earned. $23,000 in one deposit. It would grow quietly for years before anyone in that family had any idea it existed. That was the moment I understood what Claudia was actually afraid of. It wasn't concern. It was the specific discomfort that comes from watching someone you've categorized as manageable start to exceed the category. What I didn't know was that she was already paying attention more carefully than I realized. The second time, Mateo was 4. Daniel and I were in the early stage of what would become 2 years of marital deterioration. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a slow and grinding drift that I think we both recognized, but neither of us named directly. I had started consulting independently by then, taking on clients through a structure I had built carefully outside of my regular employment, entirely above board, properly documented. I had a meeting with a financial advisor named Gregory Ackefer, who had been managing a small but growing portfolio on my behalf for about 18 months. The Ferreras did not know about Gregory. They did not know about the portfolio. They did not know about the consulting structure. Claudia called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was walking back from that meeting. It was a check-in call, she did those sometimes, which always felt more like reconnaissance than care. She asked about Mateo, about Daniel, about whether I was keeping up with everything. Then, almost as an aside, she mentioned that Roland had a contact at a property management company who was looking for someone with financial background to do basic administrative work. Part-time, she thought it might give me more flexibility with Mateo. I was standing on a sidewalk in Hartford, carrying a folder that contained a summary of a portfolio Gregory had been building, a real estate investment trust that had, at that point, appreciated to something in the range of $240,000. A property I had acquired an indirect stake in through the investment vehicle Gregory had recommended, which had been growing quietly since before Mateo started walking. I told Claudia it was a thoughtful idea and I would think about it. Then I went home, put Mateo to bed, and called Gregory to confirm we were on track for the next acquisition review in the spring. The implicit lesson I took from that phone call was one I had been learning in pieces. The Ferreras did not see me because they had decided not to. And people who have decided not to see you will keep not seeing you right up until the moment the lights come on. But Claudia was getting closer. I could feel it. The third incident happened when Mateo was 6, about a year and a half before the conference room. Daniel and I had filed for divorce that spring, a mutual legal decision that was far less amicable in practice than it sounded on paper. The custody arrangement was temporary while negotiations continued. Mateo was with me 5 days a week and with Daniel for the remaining 2. It was imperfect. I lived with imperfect because I was focused on the larger structure. At a gathering at Vivian's house that summer, I was still attending those, for Mateo's sake, because I believed at the time that maintaining a civil surface was in his best interest. Claudia cornered me near the kitchen while everyone else was outside. She was warm that afternoon. She always softened right before she said something pointed. Daniel is going to need stability, she said. You know that, right? The kids need a stable home environment. I just want you to think about whether fighting this is really worth it for Mateo. She meant stop, step back, accept whatever terms come, be smaller. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the meeting I had scheduled for that Monday morning with an attorney named Devin Ashworth, a family law specialist out of Hartford who came recommended by Gregory's colleague at the firm. I had made that appointment 6 weeks earlier, before the summer gathering, before Claudia's kitchen conversation. I had walked into Devin's office on a Thursday afternoon in early July and spent 2 hours going through the financial disclosure we had requested on June 19th. I had brought documentation. I had brought the portfolio summary. I had brought the college fund records. Devin had looked across his desk at everything I laid out and said, quietly, Nora, you are in a much stronger position than you know. Standing in that kitchen with Claudia looking at me with her expression of rehearsed concern, I thought about what Devin had said. I smiled at Claudia. I told her I was just trying to do what was best for Mateo, which was the truth. It just wasn't the version of the truth she was expecting. You should be grateful for how much this family has supported you, she said. Her voice had dropped, that thing she did when she was shifting from performance to sincerity, though the two were sometimes hard to tell apart. The word hit different than she intended. I am, I told her, just not for what you think. She blinked 3 times fast, that was Claudia's tell. It happened when something landed that she hadn't planned for. I excused myself to go check on Mateo. The months between that summer gathering and the March morning in the conference room were the most controlled months of my life. I use that word deliberately, controlled, not because I felt calm, but because I had made a decision, somewhere around the time Daniel and I first filed, that every move I made from that point forward was going to be deliberate. I was not going to react. I was going to respond on my own schedule when the conditions were right. Devin Ashworth had been building our legal position since July. We had requested the full financial disclosure on June 19th. By September, the picture of the marital finances was clear enough that Devin had begun laying out what a final custody and asset arrangement could look like, one that protected Mateo's stability, that accounted for the college fund I had been building independently, that factored in the real estate investment trust Gregory had been managing. Devin was methodical. He was the kind of attorney who paused before he spoke, like he was running the sentence through a filter first. I trusted that quality entirely. Gregory Ackeffer had been equally steady. By the fall of that year, the portfolio he managed on my behalf had cleared $260,000 in total value. The college fund for Mateo sat at a little over $68,000. Gregory had recommended I keep both structures out of any joint accounts, which I had done from the beginning, which meant they were cleanly mine. "You've been disciplined about this," he told me during our October review meeting. That's going to matter. I had kept both structures out of conversations with the Ferreras entirely. Not because I was hiding anything, the disclosures were formal and legal, and Devin had handled them properly, but because the Ferreras had a way of treating information as ammunition, and I had learned not to hand them the clip. The close calls in those months were real. There were two that I remember with particular clarity. The first one happened in October, at Vivienne's birthday dinner. I had come with Mateo, the custody schedule had him with me that week, and the evening was one of those family occasions where everyone performs ease while doing something else underneath it. Roland was there. Claudia was there. Three cousins I barely knew. Vivian at the head of the table, wearing a cream-colored blouse and watching everything. Roland asked about my work. He did it casually, the way he always did, like it was small talk rather than information gathering. Still doing the analyst thing, he said, pouring himself more wine. "I consult," I said, "mostly financial planning work." "Still with the same firm?" "Independent," I said. He nodded slowly. "Good money in that?" I always thought that kind of work was tough to scale. I picked up my water glass. "It has its challenges and its rewards." Claudia was watching from across the table. I could see her working through something. "I heard you might be looking at some property," she said. Just like that, dropped in without preamble. My hand did not tighten on the glass. "Where did you hear that?" She shrugged, one of her elegant small shrugs. "Someone mentioned something, I might have gotten it wrong." She hadn't gotten it wrong exactly, but she also hadn't gotten it right. There was a property one Gregory had been evaluating as a potential addition to the trust structure. Nothing had been decided. Nothing had been purchased. There was nothing to confirm or deny. "People hear all kinds of things," I said and smiled at Vivian. "Happy birthday, the lamb is wonderful." Vivian's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a recognition that I wasn't going to give Claudia what she was fishing for. Whether Vivian was aware of what Claudia was trying to do, I was never entirely sure. That was always the ambiguous thing about Vivian. She saw everything and responded to very little, which could mean she was complicit or simply disengaged. I had stopped trying to determine which. Under the table, I texted Devin one word: accelerate. He responded the next morning. He had already been thinking the same thing. That was the moment I understood how close to the edge I was operating, and how little Claudia understood about where the edge actually was. She thought she was fishing in open water. She didn't know the fence was already there. The second close call happened in January, about 10 weeks before the conference room. Mateo had come home from a weekend at Daniel's with something off about him. Not sick, just quiet in the way kids get when something is sitting on them that they don't have words for. I gave him dinner, gave him his bath, let him pick the book that night. He picked the one about the bear and the old lady, which he had been picking since he was 5, and I took as a sign that he needed comfort rather than novelty. After the light was out, he said, from the dark, "Mom, is it true you have to go away?" Sat very still on the edge of his bed. "Where did you hear that, buddy?" "Aunt Claudia said you might have to go far away for a long time, like you might not be around." I breathed through it. I kept my voice level. "I'm not going anywhere, Mateo. I'm right here." She said sometimes moms have to leave and they say they'll come back, but they don't. I waited until he was asleep. Then I went to the kitchen, sat at the table, and wrote down, word for word, everything he had told me. I dated it. I saved it. And I called Devin Ashworth at 7:30 the next morning. "This is a pattern," Devin said. "We need to document every instance, date and time, what was said, how you heard about it." "I know," I said. "If she's coaching him, Nora, that's a specific legal problem." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. You need to be able to prove it, not just his word about what she said, direct evidence. I told him I would work on it. I already had an idea forming. What I didn't know was how fast things were about to move. The look on Mateo's face that night, that careful, worried 8-year-old face trying to hold something too heavy for him, was the thing that changed my timeline. Not the portfolio, not the legal position, not any of it. That face was the thing that made me decide I was done waiting for the right moment. I was going to make the right moment myself. I told Mateo I loved him, that I would see him in 2 days, and I watched him walk up Daniel's front steps with his backpack on a Tuesday evening in the first week of February. Then I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and did not move for a long time. What Claudia had been doing had been building for months. The comments she fed Mateo in the background of phone calls. The things he repeated back to me in the dark of his bedroom. She had been patient about it, which told me she understood she was doing something that required patience, something that would only work if the accumulation was slow enough that I couldn't point to a single moment and call it what it was. But I had been taking notes. Literally. A document on my laptop dated entries going back to October, recording what Mateo said when he said it, which weekend it followed. Devin had told me to start the document. I had been meticulous. And I had one idea that I had been holding for the right moment. Mateo called me most nights when he was at Daniel's. Not because Daniel discouraged it, Daniel was, in his own limited way, not trying to destroy our son, but because Mateo was 8 years old and 8-year-olds want their routines. He called at 7:30, usually. We talked about school, about whatever he had eaten, about things he'd seen that day. The calls were short and ordinary, and I cherished every single one of them. On a Tuesday evening in the second week of February, before I knew what that night's call would bring, I was working late. I called Mateo first to tell him I'd be an hour behind our usual time. That's okay, he told me. His voice was easy, relaxed. Mom, can I tell you something? Always. Aunt Claudia was here today. She came to drop something off for Dad. I waited. She told me something. She said you're gonna be gone for a really long time. Like, she said you might have to go far away for work and you might not be able to call. My hand tightened on the phone. Not visibly, there was no one there to see it, but inside something shifted. Buddy, I said carefully, did she say anything else? He was quiet for a second. She said sometimes moms go away and it doesn't mean they don't love you, like they just have to go. A pause, then in a smaller voice, are you going away, Mom? Three things happened simultaneously in my body. My throat closed, my vision went slightly sharp the way it does when adrenaline arrives, and something that had been soft and patient inside me went absolutely hard. Through all three of it. Mateo, I am not going anywhere. I am right here and I will call you tomorrow night at the same time. That is a promise. Okay, he was quiet then. Can we do the volcano science thing this weekend? Yes, absolutely yes. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. Then I made a decision, not the careful kind of decision I had been making for months. A different kind. The next time Mateo called, I was going to ask him to do something. Not a complicated thing, an 8-year-old thing, simple enough that he wouldn't think twice about it, and specific enough that it would do exactly what I needed it to do. The following Tuesday, I told Mateo I had a late meeting and asked him if Aunt Claudia stopped by while we were on the phone to keep our call going on speaker while he went about his evening. I told him I liked hearing the normal sounds of the house, dinner being made, the television in the background. He thought this was entirely unremarkable. 8-year-olds accept the small eccentricities of their parents without interrogation. Sure, Mom, he said. I'll just put it on the table. On speaker on the table. Yes, that's perfect. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with a glass of water and my laptop and my notes open. I was not nervous. Or rather, I was something that looked like calm from the outside but was running at a very high frequency underneath. I had the recording function open on my phone, set to capture my end of the call. I positioned it close. He called at 7:22. We talked about the volcano science kit I had ordered, about a book his teacher had given his class about whether dogs or cats were smarter. He was animated and easy and entirely himself. And I sat there listening, asking questions, keeping the conversation going, waiting. At 7:48 I heard it, a door in the background, footsteps. And then Claudia's voice, not directed at the phone, not careful, clearly not aware she was anywhere near a live call. Mateo, sweetheart, who are you talking to? My mom. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Oh, her voice adjusted, became the version of warm she performed for children. Well, don't talk too long, okay? You need to get ready for bed. Your mom has a lot going on right now. I said nothing. I continued looking at my laptop screen. Mateo, entirely unbothered. She said she'd call every night. That's sweet, Claudia's voice closer now. But sometimes grown-ups say things when they're just trying to make you feel better, you know. It doesn't always mean it's going to happen exactly like that. I wrote down the time, 7:49. My mom always calls, Mateo said. I know, baby. She was performing Patience Now, the kind that's a rapper for something else. But you know your mom is dealing with a lot of changes. Sometimes things change and people move on to new parts of their lives. And that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. It just means things are different now. You're old enough to understand that. My pen stopped moving on the paper. My son was 8 years old. He was in his pajamas, probably, talking to his mother on the phone, and his aunt was standing 5 feet away telling him that the person on the other end of that line was a category of loss he needed to prepare for. I did not make a sound. I waited until Claudia had moved away from the phone. I waited until Mateo's voice came back, normal and easy, telling me about something his friend had done at recess. I stayed on the call for another 12 minutes. I said goodnight the way I always did, same words, same order, the little ritual we had built when he was 6. He repeated his part back to me, which he always did. He hung up. I sat in the silence of my kitchen for approximately 4 seconds. Then I picked up my phone, went to my contacts, and called Devin Ashworth. It was 8:03 in the evening. He answered on the second ring. I have a recording, I said, not just my notes, an actual recording. I can send it tonight. I heard him set something down on his desk. How clear is it? Clear enough. Her voice, his voice, the conversation, all of it? Devin was quiet for a moment, that filtering pause I had come to recognize as his version of controlled excitement. Nora, that changes the timeline. I've been waiting to schedule the full disclosure review for next month, but if we have audio documentation of parental alienation coaching, we move now. That's what I want, I said. File everything, move up the timeline, I want this done. I'll have my office call Daniel's attorney first thing tomorrow. We request the formal meeting. You and me on one side, them on the other, and we play the recording in the room. I looked at my kitchen table, the water glass, the laptop, the notes I had been taking for months. All of it patient and deliberate and finally arriving at its purpose. Good, I said. Devin scheduled it for a Tuesday morning 3 weeks out. I spent those 3 weeks the way I had spent the previous 8 months, with precision. I pulled together the full financial documentation Gregory had been preparing, the college fund statements, the portfolio summary, the dated notes, the recording. I gave everything to Devin, and he organized it in the way that attorneys organize things when they are preparing to walk into a room and dismantle someone's position completely. I told no one in the Ferreira family what was coming. I went to work. I called Mateo every night. I made the volcano science kit with him that weekend. It went exactly as spectacular as he had hoped, and we stood in the backyard laughing at the mess it made, and I photographed his face in that moment and saved it on my phone because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be doing the right thing for the right person. The look on Claudia's face when she walked into that conference room and saw me sitting there with Devin at my side and a folder on the table, told me she had not been warned. Daniel had not told her about the meeting. I would find out later that he had simply said there was a scheduling issue to discuss. He had not wanted to worry her. Or perhaps he had understood somewhere that involving his sister was going to complicate things in a direction he was not prepared to manage. Sat down across from me. Roland was not there. It was Claudia, Daniel, and Daniel's attorney, a man named Stuart Pack, who I had never met but who had the look of someone who spent his career expecting the other side to be underprepared. He had a yellow legal pad. He was already writing on it when I walked in. Stuart looked at Devin. Devin nodded the way professionals acknowledge each other. Shall we get started? Stuart said. Devin placed his folder on the table. Please, he said. And that was when I reached into my bag and put my phone on the center of the table. Claudia looked at the phone the way you look at something that doesn't make sense in the room it's in. Her head tilted 2 degrees to the left. Daniel looked at Stuart. Stuart had stopped writing. Devin folded his hands on the table. His voice was even, unhurried. Before we begin the scheduled items on today's agenda, my client has some material she'd like to present. I'm going to ask you to listen without interruption, and then we'll talk. Stuart's pen lifted. What kind of material? An audio recording, approximately 4 minutes in length, documented, dated, and fully admissible. Claudia's hand moved to her collarbone, a small, involuntary gesture, fingers just resting there at the base of her throat. We weren't informed of any recording, Stuart said. You're being informed now. Devin looked at me. I pressed play. The room held Mateo's voice first, easy and bright, talking about something ordinary. I watched Daniel's face as he heard his son. Something moved through Daniel's expression that I won't analyze here because it was private and I am not entirely without mercy. He heard his child and he went still. Then Claudia's voice filled the room. I watched her face go through its changes in order. The first was recognition, pure, immediate, unmistakable. She knew her own voice. The second was a rapid reassessment of what the room now meant. She looked at Daniel. He was still looking at the phone. He wouldn't look back at her. The recording played. When she told Mateo that sometimes moms move on to new parts of their lives, Stuart Pack put his pen down on the legal pad and left it there. When she told my 8-year-old son that he was old enough to understand that people leave, Daniel closed his eyes. When the recording ended, the room was quiet for the length of 4 full seconds. Then Devin reached across and turned the phone face down, calmly, like closing a book. That recording, Devin said, is one of 11 documented incidents in which my client has evidence of her son being coached to accept his mother's absence as imminent and inevitable. The other 10 are written, dated, and corroborated by the child's own statements to my client, which she has been recording in written form since October 14th of last year. Claudia opened her mouth. A sound came out that wasn't quite a word. She closed it again. Stuart turned to look at her. It was a particular kind of look, the look of an attorney who has just watched his side of the table do something that cannot be undone. Claudia? Daniel's voice was low and flat. Were you talking to him about this? Her chin came up. When Claudia was cornered, she went still first and then she performed composure. I had seen it at the kitchen sink in Vivian's house. I had seen it at dinner tables. I watched her do it now. I was trying to help him, she said. He was asking questions and I was trying to prepare him. I was not coaching him. I was having a conversation with an 8-year-old, I said, about whether or not I was coming back. Her eyes moved to me for the first time since the recording ended. There was something in her face that was not quite the performance she usually managed, something more exposed, like a layer had been removed against her will. You're twisting what it sounds like, she said. The recording sounds like what it sounds like. Stuart touched Claudia's arm once, a small, professional gesture that meant stop talking. She complied, but her chest was moving with a visible, controlled breathing effort. Devin continued. In the context of the current custody proceedings, this recording and the accompanying documentation constitute evidence of parental alienation. We will be presenting this to the court unless an agreement is reached today that fully addresses my client's position. Daniel was looking at the table. He was a man who had in that moment understood something about his sister that he had perhaps known but never been forced to look at directly. His hands were in his lap. He looked like someone sitting at a loss, not defensive, not angry, just suddenly very tired. Daniel, Stewart's voice was careful. I'd like a moment with my client. We'll step out, Devin said. We went to the hallway. I stood with my back against the wall and breathed. The hallway had that particular quality of corporate building air, filtered and slightly cold and entirely neutral. I focused on that, the neutrality of it. Devin stood next to me. They need about 10 minutes, he said quietly. Then we go back in and we get what you came for. I looked at him. Do you think Stuart knew? About the coaching? Devin shook his head. No, that was genuine. He's good and he's not going to touch it. It's too far over the line and he knows it. I nodded. You did everything right, Devin said. The documentation, the recording, the timing. Every piece of it is clean. I thought about Mateo on the phone, talking about dogs versus cats, while his aunt stood 5 feet away undoing something that should never have needed to be undone. It shouldn't have had to be clean, I said. It shouldn't have had to exist. No, Devin agreed. It shouldn't. We went back in after 12 minutes. Stuart had reorganized his legal pad. Claudia had moved her chair back a few inches from the table, which I understood as a shift in her sense of territory. She was no longer sitting like someone who belonged at this table. Daniel had a glass of water in front of him that hadn't been there before. Stuart spoke first. We'd like to address the issue of the recording directly. Without prejudging what a court might conclude, my client Daniel Ferreira, is prepared to acknowledge that the interaction documented on that recording was inappropriate and contrary to Mateo's best interests. Claudia's jaw tightened. She was looking at the middle distance. Claudia is not a party to these proceedings, Stuart continued, but we understand the relevance. She will be if this goes to a judge, Devin said. I want to be clear about that. A pause. Understood. Devin opened his folder. My client's position is as follows. He walked through it in order, the custody arrangement she was requesting, the college fund documentation, the financial disclosures, the specific terms. He was thorough and he was not unkind, he was simply precise. Each item landed on the table like something that had been measured and cut to fit. Claudia interrupted at the college fund. You've been hiding assets, she said. Not to me, she was looking at Devin like she could redirect this through procedure. The account wasn't disclosed. It was disclosed, Devin said. On June 19th. Page 14 of the financial disclosure packet your side's attorney received. The account was established prior to the marriage and has been maintained independently throughout. It is not a marital asset. It is a custodial account for Mateo's education, held in my client's name as trustee. Claudia turned to Stuart. Is that she can do that? Stuart did not look at her. It's consistent with how the account was structured. Yes. It's $68,000, Claudia said, and her voice had climbed slightly in register, tighter, higher, not quite controlled. She's been sitting on $68,000 for Matteo and she never said anything. I was saving it for Matteo, I said. That's what it was for. You were hiding it. I looked at her directly. Claudia, I was building a college fund for my son, the same way I've been doing everything else in this situation, quietly, correctly, and with documentation. She stared at me. For the first time in 8 years of dinners and phone calls and kitchen conversations and tolerant neutrality, I watched Claudia Ferrer Moss genuinely not know what to say. Her mouth opened and what came out was, "You planned this." "Yes," I said, "I planned all of it." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a person realizes, in real time, that the story they had been telling about someone else was not the accurate story. That the woman they had been managing and advising and gently redirecting for the better part of a decade had not been any of the things they needed her to be. "How long?" Daniel's voice was quiet. He was asking me, not his attorney. I thought about the right way to answer that. "Long enough," I said. He nodded once. Like that was the right answer, even if it wasn't a comfortable one. Devin walked Stewart through the remaining items with a thoroughness that left nothing to negotiate around. Custody schedule, primary physical custody to me, structured and generous visitation for Daniel, with the explicit condition that Claudia Ferrer Moss was not to have unsupervised access to Mateo during any visitation period without my prior written consent. The college fund, untouched, growing, fully in my control as trustee. The real estate investment portfolio, clearly established as my independent asset, outside the marital estate. Stewart asked for a recess to confer with Daniel. Claudia asked to join that conference. Stewart told her in the most civil possible phrasing that it would be better if she waited in the lobby. I watched her leave the room. She walked the way people walk when they are holding themselves together through sheer force of habit, spine straight, chin level, but she reached for the door handle a half second too early, misjudged the distance, and had to recorrect. It was a small thing. But I had been watching Claudia Ferrer Moss for 8 years, and I had never once seen her misjudge a distance. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When Stewart and Daniel returned, Daniel looked like a man who had arrived at a decision he had been avoiding for longer than the morning. He sat down. He looked at me, not at Devin, not at Stewart, at me. "I want Mateo to be okay," he said. "That's the only thing I actually want out of this." "It's the only thing I want too," I said. He nodded. Then he looked at Stewart and said, "Let's agree to her terms." Stewart began writing on the legal pad. The agreement was signed in that room that afternoon. Devin had the documents prepared. He had expected this outcome, or something close to it, and he was not a man who went into rooms unprepared. Signatures were exchanged. Dates were confirmed. Mateo's custody schedule was formalized in language that was specific and enforceable and built to hold. I walked out of that building at 2:15 in the afternoon. The sky was still gray, still uncommitted. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, my bag over my shoulder, Devin next to me. "That's it," he said. "That's it," I agreed. He extended his hand and I shook it and we went our separate ways. I called Mateo that evening at 7:30. He answered on the first ring and spent 8 minutes telling me about something that had happened at school, involving a broken lunchbox and a substitute teacher, and a genuinely complicated series of events that I followed very carefully. He was entirely himself. He was fine. I made a note on my phone, not a legal note, just a personal one. "He's fine. He's 8. He still thinks dogs are smarter than cats." In the weeks that followed, the pieces of the agreement settled into place. The custody schedule held. Daniel abided by it without drama, which I had always believed he would. Daniel was not, at his core, a bad father. He was a man who had allowed his sister to act in his name for too long, and that had cost him, and I think he understood that. Claudia did not immediately disappear from the Ferrara family orbit. She was blood, and the Ferraras were organized around blood in the way that certain families are, without question, without revision. But something shifted in the way she was treated in the rooms I was aware of secondhand. Vivienne, who had been so carefully neutral for so long, called me in early April. It was a short call. She said she was sorry that things had got to where they had. She said she hoped Mateo was doing well. I told her he was. She said she was glad. It was not a repair. It was not even the beginning of a repair. But it was the first time in 8 years that Vivienne Ferrer had called me to say something kind without any performance attached to it, and I held that for what it was, small, real, and enough. Roland Moss filed for a legal separation from Claudia in May. I found out through Daniel, who mentioned it briefly during a custody exchange, with the look of a man who was not surprised but had not prepared anything useful to say about it. Whatever had been strained in that marriage before the conference room, the contents of that morning had apparently been the thing that tipped the balance. I did not ask for details. It was not my business. Claudia moved into a rental property in West Hartford. She called me once in June from a number I didn't recognize. When I realized it was her, I let the voicemail play. She said she wanted to explain. I did not call back. Explanation was not what the situation needed. What it needed, what Mateo needed, was the absence of those particular conversations in the background of his evenings. That was already in place. The legal language had seen to it. Gregory's portfolio cleared $280,000 in total value by the following spring. The college fund continued to grow. Mateo's education was not a question mark. It had never been, not really, but now it was formalized, protected, entirely out of reach of any external interference. Mateo joined a weekend science club at his school in the fall. He called me after his first session with the kind of excitement that comes out sideways, talking faster than usual, jumping between topics, unable to quite organize the things he wanted to tell me. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to every word. He asked me at the end of that call if I was ever going to go away for a long time. I said no. He said okay. Then he said he'd made something at Science Club he wanted to show me when I picked him up on Thursday. I'll be there at 3:30, I said. I know, he said, you're always there. I have always been there. That was never in question, not for a single day, and now the people who needed to understand that had a document in their possession that made it permanently, legally clear. I don't hate Claudia. What I feel when I think about her is something closer to a kind of weary recognition of what she needed me to be, and why she needed it, and how little any of that was ever actually about me. People who build themselves on comparison are fragile in a specific way. They need you smaller to stay standing. I stopped being smaller and she fell. I didn't push her. The structure she had built just couldn't hold. Mateo is doing well. He still calls every night. So, was I right to record that call without warning anyone? Or did I go too far? Tell me in the comments.